Well, welcome everyone. And tonight we're talking about teaching with Superani Book 2, specifically pacing, but based on some feedback and from the past couple of webinars, I decided to put some more specific things in there as well. The presentation itself will be available afterwards. So if there was something that you wanted a closer look at, that will be available. And my email address will be at the end. If you want to contact me, I'm happy to send you anything as well. Um, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself formally. I'm Lee Grace Rie. This is my second year working for Hands Up. If you are interested in more of our trainings, or if you've missed some and you want to watch the recordings, you can scan that. Again, it'll be available later as well. Um, let's see. So book two, if you were here for the book one webinar, we uh we have a very similar setup here. It's each chapter going to be 16 pages with 10 pages devoted to the language, 5 pages for civilization, history, culture, and then one page that's going to be mythology or something more specific to the history. So the pictures that you see on the left of the screen are images from each of the chapters. So it goes all the way through chapter 32, and that is the end of our journey with Sabina and her friends before book three, where things move on to more authentic texts. So right here, I wanted to show you just kind of an overview. For those of you who like to kind of see the big picture, the link right there will get you to these pages. It starts off in Pompeii. So one thing I love about this textbook is that we get to see all parts of the empire. And so we start off in Pompeii a few years before Vesuvius. And then we're going to make our way over to Carthage. And then we're in Rome very briefly before heading to Greece and then later Ephesus and back to Rome. So when you're trying to divide up this particular book and you're trying to look for stopping points and where you might want to take a break, a lot of them would very easily be done with just going from place to place. So the civ and the history kind of plays well into dividing up units if you wanted to stick with that. Um, Also, for what I prefer to divide them up with is based on language. So, for example, if you look in chapter 22, deponent verbs are introduced, and that is usually something I have to devote a lot of time to. And it ends up being its own thing. I do chapter 22 by itself, so we can all just uh deal with deponents together. However, 17, 18, 19 work well, and then 2021, and then so on and so forth. So looking at the language, or looking at the places, those are some really easy ways to divide it up. But you also might want to look at how many stories are in each chapter, and I'm going to show you a page on that as well in just a minute. I do want to, before we continue on, just reemphasize that there is no one size fits all or correct way to teach this book. We just want to give you some options. We appreciate collaboration. A lot of things that I do have come from the community. And so things that are important to you might not be as important to someone else. So we want to make sure that you tailor your class to the best of your ability to your students and your needs. Some common questions we get on book two. Basically, how do we start book two? And that's going to be different for different people. So some programs are going to finish book one in Latin one, and they're going to start book two in Latin two. And so there's very natural end and start points there. I personally don't do that with mine. We end in chapter 14 with book one. So we begin Latin two still in book one. So for us, we are going right from book one into book two because there isn't a delay. If you are going book one, Latin one, and then book two and Latin two, then you might want to spend some time reviewing before you start book two. Um, can you finish book two in a year? Yes. Should you? That's up to you. I would say that unlike book one, the end of book two starts to get a little meatier as far as how many stories there are, and some of the grammatical concepts might require more time. I know that I personally get through chapter 26 in Latin 2, and then we finish through chapter 32 in Latin 3. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second as well with how quickly you can pace this. Um, I try to give an assessment every other week, either a quiz of some sort, a unit test at the end of several chapters. But a lot of times we find that teachers have to give assessments every so often, or they're required to give a certain number per quarter or unit or whatnot. So that, of course, is going to differ between between programs as well. Um, we are going to talk about some projects and fun stuff with book two. I think book two has a lot of fun stuff. So we'll talk about those, and I can give you some resources and ideas for that as well. And then, a lot of people ask about transitioning from the sheltered language in books one and two into book three. So we love that we now have book three available. William talked to us last time about that. And so the goal is to have them finish book two and be able to go into authentic text. Now, um, whether or not your students are ready for AP, they might need to have book three as a companion into the AP curriculum. But then again, it might be something that is useful while teaching it as well. But again, that's going to differ with each program. Several of the grammatical concepts that and language devices that they might need are introduced in book three as well that aren't introduced in book two. So that's something to keep in mind if your program culminates in an AP class. All right, so this right here is the thing I was talking about that shows you what is in each chapter. I find this very helpful with book two, especially because as you can see, most chapters have at least five stories, whereas in book one, several had three or four. Now they all, but maybe one chapter has at least five. And then some of the later chapters have seven or eight stories. So we don't expect that every class is going to see every story. It's not necessary. But if you were trying to decide, hey, which stories do they really need to look at so they know what's going on? And which ones can we skip? Which ones are going to be showing them a lot of language that they need to review? Whereas which ones are just something that maybe we can go over quickly a synopsis of. So at the link that I have right here, every chapter, it has this for book one as well. But I find it especially helpful with book two. It shows you what each story is and what characters are featured in it and a little bit of a synopsis of it, as well as where the language notes occur and any cultural information associated with it. So as you can see, chapter 17 is kind of the flagship chapter I used for this presentation. It deals with Pompeii itself, but also the Domus, which is a fun, always fun project or information to glean apart from the stories. So and they have the Phalonica with the laundry, and there's so many different things, but not all of them are vital to move on to chapter 18. So if you wanted to skip some, you maybe could make your decision based here. I would not venture to tell you which ones you should skip, but if you needed to, this would be a good resource. So I wanted to kind of take you through teaching a chapter. This particular setup assumes that you meet 5 times a week for around 45 to 50 minutes. And a typical day plan is going to consist of some sort of bell ringer, looking at a story in some sort of way, either grammar or culture as a focus, and then either some sort of assessment of comprehension, whether that be a reading comp, class discussion, having the students produce something, maybe a drawing, cartoon, other activity. And then some days are going to be devoted to things that are not necessarily within the textbook itself. So, um, we have some culture-based projects or activities that we can do. I show movies more in Latin 2 than I do in Latin 1. There's I'm going to show you the Pompeii video I showed, but also the novella. We talked a little bit about the Keller novella in book 1. There are other novellae that might lend themselves well to book 2 that you might want to use as a way to break up in between chapters. This is an overview of teaching chapter 17. I wanted to show you just kind of a overview, and then I'm going to kind of break it down what some of these mean. So if you see orange, on that day, we were doing a story from the textbook. So you can see that about 5 days for chapter 17 was spent solely on stories from the text. The purple were things that were either civ, history, or grammar that was primarily from either the textbook or a Subarani resource. The purplish color, which is kind of hard to tell on my screen, I don't know if for you, but these 3 squares here had to do with a project that I assigned on the Roman Domus. And then the pink color here were things that were supplemental that were not necessarily from the text, but I wanted to do with my students as a way to specifically the Arcaparwa story in chapter 17 is taken, it's an adapted version of Catullus 13. So we do Catullus 13 together. And then they have a quiz just on chapter 17. As well as their project due. So in 14 class days, we were able to get through an entire chapter, and that was with a project. So if we took out the project, if we took out the doing the Catullus poem together, then you could do this in 9 days, and still get some culture and civ and grammar in there as well as the stories. Um, so I wanted to show you some of the things that I'm referring to in my overview. So when we're going over the stories, sometimes those stories are illustrated like they are in the Prima Luce story and the Domus Deserta story. And sometimes we're looking at these pictures, we're discussing them, we're translating them together. Sometimes I'm assigning a student one of the numbered blocks. Sometimes I'm dividing them into the little pods to work on this. Sometimes they're doing a comprehension activity like the one all the way to the right of the screen. This one is a hands-up resource that you can get on the Chapter 17 Teacher Resources section of the active book on the website. And you can see the questions that go along with it. So maybe I have students looking at the story and answering questions. Maybe they're illustrating what they see. Maybe we're doing an activity with vocabulary. I included the picture for the in Follonica because I wanted to show you that one thing that is also great about these stories is that they're getting the culture and the civilization with the stories themselves, even if you don't spend time explicitly on that culture. So there's pictures in the textbook as well as information in the stories themselves. Along with this, there are teacher notes for each story that are going to give you the translations and any information that you might want to supplement their learning with. We also have copies of these stories on the website in Word document form. If you wanted to manipulate these stories in some way with the students beyond just having them look at the text and translate it, there's different activities that you can do taking those Word documents, maybe snipping parts of the story and having them fill in the blank, maybe dividing it up and scrambling it and having them unscramble, although sometimes that is also done for some of the stories already if you wanted to use that activity. But there's different things that you might want to use those resources for. I try not to do the same thing every time we're going through a new story. There's also some really fantastic information for the Civ. I love teaching the layout of a Roman house, especially when we're talking about Pompeii. It's something that is really fun when the kids get a chance to actually go to Pompeii one day and they get to see these things that they've learned about. It really is something cool. So I always make sure that we don't only talk about it, but we also do a project with it. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that. But then we have information about Pompeii as well if you wanted to talk to them about the archaeological site. And so we have ways that you can just use the textbook and the things that are there, and students would get this information without you having to supplement with other activities, if you so chose. Um, Additionally, let's see. There are lots of ways that we can reinforce the grammar. There are notes as well as practice. And if you haven't taken a look at the uh, verb trainers or other grammar practice games and activities that are on the website under activities and games, you can see that there's matching or sorting, there's verb trainer, there's vocab trainer, all sorts of ways to reinforce those things as part of in class or students on their own. And then with vocabulary as well. Recently, Will posted in the Facebook group that the word searches for, I think 17 through 21, 22, maybe, are posted. So if you want to have more activities to do with your kids to reinforce vocabulary, those are there now, and you can print them as well. You don't have to just do them online. The vocab trainer is another thing that we talked about in the book one pacing that we got some questions about. Some wanted to know how other teachers were using the vocab trainer. I personally have my students work on a particular chapter until they're quizzed on that chapter. So in the overview that I just showed you for chapter 17, they would know on day one that the day of the quiz, day 14, would be when their vocabulary training would be due. Now, that doesn't include weekends. So obviously they would have more like 3 full weeks, like 21 days or so before. So they would have plenty of time on their own. Other teachers don't like to assign it, make it mandatory. Again, that is up to you. If you just want to use it to monitor student progress, it can also be a great tool for that. And I always do derivatives with my students, and I love that the book has worksheets for derivatives from every chapter with the learning words and more that appear in that chapter if you like to reinforce your vocabulary learning with derivatives. That's another way to do it. Um, so I wanted to show y'all this. These are the extras, okay? Some of the things that are community-made resources or things that I have left over from when I used other textbooks or other things. So I was I learned the layout of the Roman house from this ancient PDF of the Roman villa layout, which um, I'm pretty sure it's the House of Caecilius, which there's no telling how many versions of that PDF have gone through, but that's an example of what I use when I'm teaching the layout to my students. I still use that PDF. I color code it. I draw them other pictures. We look at pictures from Pompeii online, and we really try to look at a house and examine it in a bunch of different ways. So that one is one that I have. I didn't make it, but that I use. I don't think it's on the community resources because I didn't make it and I didn't want to, try to claim it or anything like that. The practicing tenses in context and the Catullus 13 document and the Superani 17 quiz that you see, those are all available in the community resources section online. So if these are things that you would want to use, for example, I really like reinforcing grammar with practice sentences. So the practicing tenses in context, that is something that I would do on one of those grammar review days. The Catullus 13 This one I did not create. I'm not sure who shared it, but whoever did is fabulous because it is so accessible for students after reading the Arwa Parka story. They're really able to see the connections between the Catullus poem and the story that they just read, and something that over the course of two class periods we were able to do. And they get really proud that they're reading real Latin. And then the chapter 17 quiz is a quiz that I made because even though there are assessments available for each chapter online that are made by hands up, if you wanted something that was really focusing in on something specific, like the grammar or whatnot, um, this was something that I just preferred to use. And then this glorious, glorious picture here from Pompeii: The Last Day, an award-winning film from 2003. It is the perfect length to show in class. And it's something that I always like to spend a class period showing them because I think a lot of kids really don't know much about Vesuvius and the eruption or much about Pompeii. So it's a great, Pliny makes a cameo in the movie. It's a great way to give them the visual and it's a kind of pseudo documentary type film. It has a lot of facts as well as the reenactments. And just the costumes are fabulous. And for some reason, everyone is British in Italy, but it's great too. So I always make sure to show that. And online, I know that there are also I don't know where and how long ago I found it, but I know there's a whole packet of like worksheets and video guides and things for it as well. If you were to scour it, I can send you a link to it as well, but I know that it's out there. Um, and then I wanted to kind of contrast before I start this. Are there any questions so far, William? Do we have any questions? Anything?
No questions other
Okay.
than Suzanne agrees with you that the Catalyst 13 resource is an amazing resource.
Yes.
And yeah, and I also want to chime in about that Pompeii the Last Day. It's excellent, and the companion on Gladiators is also excellent.
Yes. There is one on gladiators, and I was gonna show you on this. I usually actually show them Gladiator, but if you don't have 4 class days to devote to that, then yes, the companion video is a good option because then you would only have to spend 1 class period. I'm just a sucker for Russell Crowe and Ridley Scott. What can I say? But so I wanted to kind of give you an idea, not just of a chapter, like how long a chapter takes and how to move through it, but also an entire unit. So I went ahead and looked at a unit that I do. This is actually the unit that I start the second semester with. So chapters 20 and 21. Because again, I leave chapter 22 by itself because it's introduces deponents. And I feel like passive voice is kind of enough for them. So even though I think they're in Carthage at this point, I saved 22 for later. So um I counted up that I spend around 30 class periods for the total, which is kind of consistent with between 14 and 15 days a chapter seems to be what I average. And so the things that are included in chapters 20 and 21 that I make sure to hold students accountable to are their vocabulary for learning, which becomes 40 words, 20 per chapter. They learn the difference between active and passive voice, as well as the forms for the present, imperfect, and future passive. We talk about what an ablative agent is. They learn what a perfect passive participle is. And it introduces at the end of 21 forming the perfect and pluperfect passive. The civilization focuses on Carthage as well as gladiators. Now, I love the gladiators part. So we spend a lot of time on that. And so that would absolutely be something that you wouldn't have to do, but I do. The assessments that we do are vocabulary quizzes as well as one involving conjugating the verbs, the passive voice, and then their unit test. And then the things that are extra that I do are a video on Carthage at the beginning of the unit. a gladiator paper doll research project, which I'm just realizing I forgot to put the pictures of the student projects on here, which they are fantastic. So I'm happy to share those. Maybe I'll put those on the Facebook group so you can see. It's my favorite project that I do. And then the Gladiator movie that we watch when everybody's ready for a brain break, including me. When January, the longest month of the year. So this is the overview. Let's see. So just again, that color coded system for those of you who like to see the big picture. Um, so we start off with an introduction to Carthage. Again, the pinks are things that I do that aren't necessarily affiliated with Subarani or Hands Up. They're just things that I wanted to put in there. So I have an activity with passive voice and animals that I do that I call the zoo, and they write interesting stories about animals, doing things and having things done, like crocodiles grilling um anteaters and flamingos chasing sharks. Like, anyway, and then we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, around 11 days of stories. So if you were to take out the movie, it would be significantly shorter. And some of the extra information that I do on gladiators as well, and the little projects that I have them do. Those sorts of things take longer. Um, but yes, this is what a full unit overview looks like here. So, as you were thinking about your own program and what kinds of things you might want to do, you just want to make sure you consider the time that you have. With book two, I'm assuming that you are not with middle schoolers. I could be assuming wrong, but that they're a little bit older. The content's a little more dense. There are some topics that might be a little bit more extreme. For example, in chapter 18, it deals with the topic of death, as well as funerals and things like that. And I know that I personally have had to do some things differently with certain students who were dealing with personal things. So that's something to keep in mind with the content itself. How much time you spend on it or things that you decide to skip. The sensitivity to the subject matter might be something that you take into consideration. But how much time you spend on a chapter, again, it could be between 10 to 14 days. If you only did the stories and minimal grammar, it would be on the shorter end. If you decided to pull in all of the civ, do some projects and other activities, it would take a little longer. But I also think that book two is a good time to kind of consider where your students are headed. A lot of students, at least at where I am, after Latin two, they can be done. They don't have to keep taking. And so, sometimes we are trying to just get them to the finish line. And other times we're trying to make sure they're prepared for the next step. So where you want to end and how far you want to get to would depend on where they're going to be going on the next level. So for me, we don't finish book two until the first semester of Latin three, and my students there are not currently headed toward AP, but they are headed toward like an advanced Latin reading course. So that is my priority with them. I want them to know all the different forms of the subjunctive, and I want them to have experience with meter and other things like that. So I'm going to be using the rest of my level three to get them there. Um, Trying to decide on a place to end, like where to stop in book two. That's a good thing to consider as well. So for me, um, in chapter 26 is the last chapter in Greece. That's when they are doing the oracle. Um, and so that's where we stop. We talk about the different oracles. We talk about different myths associated with soothsayers and prophecies and things like that. And that's kind of how we wrap it up. And it's a fun way to do that. And so for some of my students, that's the last time they're in a Latin class. But then when my threes start out, we kind of reviewed this year with some stuff with Olympia because of the Olympics this summer and things like that. So we used a little bit from 25 to review before going into talking about Ephesus. And so right now, my students are about to start their Roman roads. Well, today we actually started it. So in the chapter 28, I believe, it starts talking about like a lot of different ways of traveling. The Silk routes are in the Civ, and a lot of attention to how they get from place to place. There's a lot of movement. And so the projects that I'm doing with my threes right now have to do with Roman roads. So we're about to make edible Roman roads on Friday. So it's always a fun day, a fun Friday, a fun way to end the week. Um, so those are just some ways that you might want to have a stopping point. Obviously, the chapter 32 is also a good stopping point because it's the end, and it wraps up the stories with the characters and everything. Like I said earlier, when you're trying to decide when to give assessments or when to do projects, the way that the places are divided up, where they are in these chapters is a really great way to do that. I did include some things that I also had on my book one webinar just in case people wanted to take a look at that. So some of the things that I do for my daily bell ringers for everyday activities, we'll do some mini myths. We do vocabulary review games. We do daily derivatives, sometimes that come from the derivatives worksheets that Hands Up has. My Wordy Wednesdays is just my attempt at alliteration for when we do common phrases in Latin or mottos or abbreviations that they keep track of. And all of that is to keep them on track for preparing for the NLE. Um, and then I've had a lot of people ask or want to talk about how we approach stories, and those are things that we can also talk about in a lot of depth. And we have some presentations on from conferences in the past that would be happy to share with you. But there's just a lot of different ways that I know I like to approach the text. So one way that we do is the speed dating translation. That's one of my favorites, where I have students sit on the floor across from each other, and I set a timer for 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how long the story is. And when the timer goes off, one row shifts over, and then they have to kind of catch up and get to a new starting point with their new partner, and then go from there while the timer clicks again. And so they end up working with a lot of different people and kind of playing to each other's strengths. And that's always fun because they're moving around. I also just absolutely love when we do illustrated translations because you will be entertained both when their art is good and when it is bad. It is equally entertaining. So it's always something different rather than just having them write out English for Latin. The website also has all kinds of games. So if you like to do games or if you like to kind of incentivize your students with a game, there's all kinds of fun things. I think chapter 17 has the rotofracta, some sentences for that game. I know that's a fun one as well. Um, and then just to recap some of the regular assessments that I do, I require them to do the vocabulary trainer. I give separate vocabulary quizzes. If there's something that is new and maybe kind of scary, I do a separate quiz for grammar. So, for example, they just had an ablative absolutes quiz in chapter 27. So I gave it its own quiz before they took their unit test. And then sometimes their culture is only assessed through the projects. Other times it's included on a test, or I would make it its own quiz. For example, the gladiators that we talked about, I do the project and they do the movie. I don't give them a separate test on it because they spend so much time doing research on it. Um, As for the unit tests, I still design them the same way that I do for book one, in that they get one or two passages. Part assesses comprehension, and part assesses grammar. Um, I don't usually do separate grammar questions on a unit test, because I usually do that on the quizzes. It's more cohesive and application based. Okay, that's all I have for that, but I am more than happy to answer your questions. I would love to hear from you if you don't mind giving us some feedback, especially as we are planning next semester's webinars. I know William and I would love to know if there's a specific topic that you are eager to hear more about. So please, please, please let us know what we can do better, and if you have a suggestion for what you would like to hear more of. If you would like to join us for our next one, we have a little bit of a break. Our next one is October 21st. That is because Will and I will be at Flava next week, and William and Will be at Camwis and TCA the week after that. The week after the in 2 weeks after that. So we have a lot going on in October and lots of chances to connect with you. So we hope that you join us for this webinar, but also if you are at Flava, or maybe you could be, but you weren't planning on it and now you want to, come see us. Or if you're going to be in the San Antonio area, I believe it's October 24th through the 26th. Is that right, William? Then go by and see William and Will. And then again in Actful in Philadelphia. Am I making that up? Yes.
In
All right.
Philadelphia, the weekend before Thanksgiving break.
That's right. So we've got a lot coming up. So I'm gonna stop sharing now, and we would love to hear from you. Let's see.
So Kay has a question. She's curious about how people engage with the history and culture readings. In the chapters, there's so many of them. What various ways have people found to engage the students? Very limited time. So compared to Yuli Grace. So
Yeah, I hear you. I know sometimes I skip things altogether, and it makes me sad because, some of these spreads are just so gorgeous. And then I like the in chapter 17, I was just kind of noticing there's this beautiful spread about perfume. And I'm like, oh, it's so pretty. I never looked at that before. So we definitely don't cover every single Civ topic. I think that each teacher is going to have an opportunity to talk about some of it, even if it's just in reference to, hey, the story takes place in Pompeii. Anybody know what happened in Pompeii? Why would they be there? And even if you just want to talk about it for a little while, I also do web quest type of things, which I would say that they don't love that as much. Ed puzzles they will put up with because they can watch them they can watch them sped up, and it's only going to take them 5 or 6 minutes. So that's another option, depending on the video, that I give them for some topics that I want them to be exposed to, but I don't necessarily need them to belabor the issue. So I know that some other teachers might do more or less. If there's anybody who wants to share how they handle the civ or culture, anybody?
I find that gamification is great, and so I usually make try to make competitions out of the culture readings. And so you hold them they need to be trained, so you hold them responsible to do the culture readings at home or outside of class, and then you come in and you set them into team competitions, whether it's Kurtamen, whether it's Jeopardy or Kaboom or um, cup stacking or cherry races. There are all kinds of games you can do, human bingo boards, for a lot of these culture readings, and you get them involved, you get them like active, and they love moving around the classroom. And also just making them take ownership of a lot of things, like making projects, like the perfume project, right? Like have them come up with something. So, or have them do $1 million listing videos for Adomas, which is a big hit with the students. And so or have them create brochures. Those are all kinds of things, like create their own ideal house and label it with the Latin terms. And so those are all things that they can do to make them take ownership and also get them engaged outside of class. And
Yes, I did a
so
similar thing with my Domus project. It's like a version of MTV Cribs. Not that they really know what that show is. And they take us through, or they don't have to use their own house. They just have to use a house. I had one girl do a stop motion video with a Lego house. It was amazing. So all kinds of different ways to incorporate it.
okay, so we do have a Spanish teacher in here at the Latin 2 group. We're so glad you're here. And I'm so glad that you're in love with the Latin group. And yes, that's one of the best things about Superani. There's so much support, and people are so generous with their resources. So please feel free to join us, reach out to Lee Grace. I'll put my email in the chat as well. That way you can always reach out to all of us if you have any questions. We're all in the Facebook group. So
And
yeah, feel free.
recently we they decided to, okay, is it sharing at hands up? Is that what it is? Sharing?
Let me check the email because that just went out today.
Yes. So today they announced that if you have anything that you want to contribute to the community resources, you can share it. I
Yeah,
believe I'm good. It's
it's
sharing.
it's sharing.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I just
sharing at hands up educate hyphen yeah
And that
.org.
will come to William and me, and we will make sure it gets on the website. Because I know that I use so many of those resources, and they really are amazing. So, if you have something or an idea, please share. We would love, to highlight that, on the website. Any other questions or comments?
Well, thank you again for joining us. Again, we'll stay behind if you want to ask questions privately. But again, thank you for coming to our webinar tonight. I know it's Monday. Some of you guys it's dinner time. Some of you guys are getting ready to go home. So please enjoy your evening. And again, um, we have enjoyed sharing with you, and we thank you for your time.
Yep. And hopefully we'll see y'all next time. Thank you.
Well, late.